dan na drugem panelu današnjega srečanja. Začel bom v slovenščini pozdrav, zaradi tega, ker sem še iz tiste generacije, ki je bila še navajena, da se je na inštitutu govorilo v slovenščini. So I started my speech in Slovene because I'm still from the generation and coming from the time when it's still in this institute Slovene was used. So now there are different times. My English is not good, it might be poor, but then if I need some of the younger generation researchers because their skill in English is much better. So let me first present our two guests in our panel, Adventures in Historiography and Memory. Our first panelist will be Magdalena Najbar-Agičić, my good friend, I must say. She's a historian and she's professor at Sveučilište Sjever v Koprivnici, University Sjever, University North in Koprivnica, at the Department of Media Studies and Journalism, and she's the author of several books and numerous scientific and professional articles in these research areas. Let me mention just some of them, of the most important monographs of her. V skladu s marksizmom ili činjenicama, hrvatska historiografija 1945-1960, According to Marxism or Facts, Croatian Historiography 1945-1960. Then the second one, Kultura, znanost, ideologija, prilazi istraživanju politike komunističke vlasti v Hrvatskoj in the same period. Culture, science, ideology, contribution to the research of the politics of communist authorities in Croatia in the same period. And for the world history, let's say, Druga republika, Poljska v međuročju 1918-1939, the Second Republic, Poland between two world wars. Our second panelist will be Ivan Smiljanić, who is historian here at our institute, a young researcher at the Institute for Contemporary History in Ljubljana. He deals with issues of cultural history in the research in bankruptcies in Slovenia in the period 1868 and 1941. He had a chance to prolong this research in nowadays time. For the scientific monograph Lavrovi, Gozdovi in Krompir, Prešernov kult v socializmu, Laurel Woods and Potatoes, the cult of Francais Prešeren in socialism, he received the Erwin Dolenc Award in 2022, which the Historical Association of Slovenia awards for the best historical debut of young researchers in the last 2 years. So, first, as I mentioned, it will be Magdalena. She will present her paper, History as a Source of Legitimacy of Government in the Socialist Yugoslavia. Magdalena, floor is yours.
Thank you. So first of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation to Zgodovina na Špici festival. And I have one small complaint to our hosts. It's really difficult situation you put us in after the lecture by Anita about Galebovi. Nothing can be interesting anymore. Yeah. So my topic is, as Aleš said, history as a source of legitimacy of government in socialist Yugoslavia, and I will rely on some of my earlier research, firstly on historiography, what was the topic of my PhD thesis. It was a long time ago, and my newer research on politics of history, what is a topic that interested me lately, let's say. So the Communist Party of Yugoslavia and, of course, the government of socialist Yugoslavia was an extremely active mnemonic actor. And due to the non-democratic political system in socialist Yugoslavia, the role of Communist Party in this plan was extremely strong. Therefore, the imposition of the one and only acceptable political narrative was quite noticeable. And of course, the politics of history of Communist Party was supposed to fulfill all the usual functions of it, so the legitimization, identification, integration, mobilization, and this function of image or PR function, let's say. But I would like to try to prove that the legitimization function was the most important, let's say. Discussions about the politics of history were probably unknown to the party officials at that time, just as today the categories of politics of history are not fully understood neither by political elites nor by public. But at the same time, the party leadership was well aware of the importance of imposing a historical narrative that would be in their favor. The character of the regime led to the situation where all state and public services, including culture, science, and education, were unquestionably placed in the function of supporting this narrative. The main focus of the politics of history was on national liberation struggle, and because of absence of basic democratic foundations of the legitimacy of power, history primarily the history of this partisan struggle and the labor movement was supposed to represent the main argument for the justification of remaining in power. At the same time, socialist Yugoslavia was formally a federal state, and a large part of the authority in the field of culture, science, and education was in the hands of leaders of individual republics. The democratic centralism of the party was, of course, a significant limitation of that formal autonomy, but the situation was not static, and there were clear, significant changes over time that reflected the strengthening and weakening of centralism and federalist tendencies during the 45 years of joint state. Here I will draw your attention only to two, let's say, aspects of very broad area, which I would call the politics of history of socialist Yugoslavia, and I will mention a few elements as an examples. I will try to illustrate which historical events, persons, and periods were used to enforce it. So first, the issue of existence of common state of South Slavs, even during the war, it was extremely important to formulate an official narrative that would interpret the entire history in the region in a new way. It was, of course, the teleological narrative in which the creation of socialist Yugoslavia represented the only possible outcome of historical events and processes. At the same time, this new narrative was formulated in some way in opposition to the previous, mainly monarchistic narrative from the interwar period. This interwar narrative was criticized because of its unitarism. At first, attempts were made to obtain this new socialist narrative, which schools, that is, teaching of history, was supposed to take over immediately, but by applying Marxist concept and generalizations. There's, for example, the book by Anto Babić, Istorija naroda Jugoslavia, printed 4 times in the years after the war. But at the end of 40s, the switch to much more complex approach happened, which was carried out within the project History of the Peoples of Yugoslavia, Historia naroda Jugoslavia. The project began in 1948. Certainly, the new political circumstances with the resolution of Cominform and the 5th Congress of Communist Party played a big role in it. The need for such book was mentioned by Milovan Đilas, so the head of the Federal Agitprop, during his report at the 5th Congress. So I dealt with the project intensively during my research for the purpose of my PhD thesis on Croatian historiography, researching among others in the archives of Ljubljana. Why? Because Slovenian historians, especially Franz Fitter, were particularly important and active in the commission that worked on this multi-volume synthesis of new states history. I would like to stress that the Historia Naroda Yugoslavia project is actually now extremely important for understanding the development of Yugoslav historiographies. It also reflected all sorts of problems, that is, the state of certain national historiographies, for example. It very clearly shows the relationship between historians and authorities, the influence of ideology on historical science, and the mutual relations between republics and nations, national historiographies within Yugoslavia. During the work on the project, conflicts and focal points came up, but also those historical moments that were most suitable for processing, let's say, in the spirit of Yugoslav socialist ideology, that was based on two pillars, materialism and even to greater extent brotherhood and unity. Quite detailed instructions on how the new narrative should look, or at least how it should not look, were given by Milovan Đilas in his text on national history as educational subject, o nacionalnoj istoriji kao vaspitnom predmetu from 1949. The project itself, whose formal initiator and initially main leader was Mitra Mitrović, so Đilas's wife and Minister of Education of Serbia, initially implied the creation of new school book, textbooks, for high school subject called National History. From the very title of the book, it is evident that the new narrative was supposed to bring together the national narratives of the peoples who made up the new Yugoslavia. This synthesis was intended as collective work. Authors and editors were chosen among historians from various republics. The history of peoples of Yugoslavia was supposed to be a collective work and a collection of new histories of the Yugoslav people based on the Marxist approach. It soon became clear that it was impossible to get one consistent book suitable for high school students. In the end, the writing of school textbook was abandoned. Instead, a new book was supposed to be the new interpreter of national history for teachers and university students. After years of work on that project, it ultimately brought only partial success. By the end of the 50s, 2 volumes were completed, covering the period from prehistory to the end of the 18th century. Even in those periods of history, it was not possible to avoid problems and disagreements. These disagreements proved to be a reason that volumes dedicated to recent history periods didn't see the light of day. The Marxist approach is clearly visible in the first volume. An attempt was made to apply periodization based on socio-economic formations to national histories in it. Already in the second volume, that aspect lost its importance. Events that can be used to highlight the brotherhood and unity of the Yugoslav peoples were important. For example, the peasant revolt of Matija Gubec. It is certainly one of the topics from Croatian history that perfectly fits into the politics of the history of socialist Yugoslavia. Not only it was about an obvious class struggle, but also the common struggle of Croatian and Slovenian peasants was an example of brotherhood and unity in 16th century. The history of the peoples of Yugoslavia project was active for next 10 years. There were discussions going on, but without any further result. A common narrative around the later periods was difficult to reconcile in 60s and beyond. And this is evident by discussions that took place regarding the publication of History of Yugoslavia by Božić, Čirković, Ekmačić, that year 1972. Also, in the case of the History of Yugoslavia, it was completely different project, and the whole situation regarding this book speaks primarily about international relations within Yugoslavia, and not so much about the politics of history of the central authorities. When we look about the history, the teaching of history of earlier periods in school in socialist Yugoslavia, we should note that the teaching of national history meant primarily a focus on the history of dominant nation in each republic, with additional lessons on the history of other Yugoslav nations. It should be noted that differently to situation of contemporary history, these older periods of history, along with certain guidance from propagated ideological settings, were primarily studied and researched by professional historians. The second example is the contemporary history, which in the time of socialist Yugoslavia mainly meant the history of the Communist Party, the labor movement, and primarily the national liberation struggle. And this contemporary history is actually the separate case, and it's in the focus of the politics of history of Communist Party. The party claimed a monopoly on the interpretation of that period and content. The leadership of Communist Party, led by Josip Broz Tito, was aware of importance of interpretative control over these topics since the very beginning of the war. The narrative about them was already present during the war, and its author was largely Tito himself, who already then published texts in partisan press. The peak of his historical, let's say, creativity belongs to the year 1948. His political report and Fifth Congress of Communist Party was the official interpretation of contemporary national history. And it states like this, actually to the end of the existence of socialist Yugoslavia, whereby one of the important elements of the crisis in 1980s was the abandonment of that narrative. Even in the publications on Yugoslav historiography that were published on the occasion of the international congresses of historians in 80s and 60s by Yugoslav Federation of Historians, Tito's report is cited as main historiographical authority for the newer history. In my dissertation, I devoted a separate chapter to that part of historiography and called it party historiography, following the name and model proposed by Czech colleague Vítězslav Sommer in his work on similar topics for the situation in Czechoslovakia. It is interesting that despite the differences between Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia in that period, the development of party historiography can be divided into the same phases, so the propagandistic, paradigmatic, and the research phase. In the period immediately after the war, the party approached the use of narrative about national liberation struggle spontaneously and in propagandistic way. The intensification of the narrative took place after Tito-Stalin conflict, after which the merits of Yugoslav partisans began to be particularly highlighted, against Soviet claims about the importance of their military assistance in the liberation of Yugoslavia. Then came the institutionalization of work in that area within the Communist Party, so by establishment of archives and later commissions for history. Around the mid-50s, the paradigmatic phase was reached. That is, the phase in which the main activity was focused on formulating an interpretative paradigm, whereby Tito's paper at the Fifth Congress was, of course, an important guide. Institutes for the history of the labor movement were founded, and the brief overview of the history of the SKU, or Pregled Historije SKU, was written in Belgrade in the beginning of 60s, which was an attempt to create an official interpretation. It failed precisely because of inter-ethnic or international relations within the Yugoslav party historiography. Further development in the last decades of the socialist period is already next research phase. So we can call it research because at that time numerous young researchers were employed in the institutions of party historiography and the institutes for the history of labor movement in each republic. And they did detailed research on various topics related to the history of party and national liberation struggle. Also, the main interpretative framework remained the same. So, when it comes to the writing about the party history, it was done either by party officials or by people who were employees of party institutions. Professional historians employed at universities mostly avoided these topics. So much in brief about historiographical research, but I would like to comment on some other phenomena related to the politics of history. Let's say for the first about some words about museums. So museums are an important element of the politics of history, but it should be mentioned that when it comes to museums, the top of the party was mostly not satisfied with the exhibitions of, in Croatian case for sure, so the Museum of the Revolution in Zagreb. It's interesting to note that when the permanent exhibition was opened in mid-50s, one member of the top party leadership in the Commission for History expressed his displeasure that only one burned village and 5 murdered children were shown. And it's not enough, of course. Other nations also have this, even Czechs and Hungarians. That means that the scale and uniqueness of struggle and suffering in partisan war in Yugoslavia had not been adequately presented. An important element of the politics of history and Communist Party from the very beginning was, of course, the calendar of holidays. A large part of this calendar was created already in 1945 and shortly after the war. Apart from the Day of the Republic, the main celebrations took place in the days of uprising, so the beginning of national liberation struggle, that were celebrated in each republic. Their chronological order in different republics reflected the main narrative about the national liberation struggle, which was linked to the activities of Supreme Staff and Tito himself. For the Croatian communists and partisans, this order was inconvenient or problematic from the beginning because it placed their uprising later than the uprising in Montenegro and Serbia. from some statements of members of the Croatian party leadership already in 1945, so Vladimir Bakarić, it appears that they were not satisfied with this. And toward the end of 1950s, the narrative about the first partisan detachment in Yugoslavia, so the Sisak partisan detachment, increasingly appeared in the public discourse, and for its introduction into the official party history, great credits goes to Franjo Tuđman, so the later Croatian president, who was the author of encyclopedic entry on national liberation struggle in Croatia, published in Vojna Encyclopedia, so a military encyclopedia from the Military Institute in Belgrade. It is likely that exactly those his merits for the Croatian partisans were decisive for appointing him head of the Institute of the History of Labor Movement in 1961. So he was the first head of this institute that was established that year. It should be mentioned that in the following decades, a lot of work was done to emphasize the merits of partisan units in Croatia. But until the end of existence of the socialist Croatia, the official holiday was the day of uprising of the peoples of Croatia on July 27th, which memorized the rebellion of Serbs in one village near Knin. It was only after Tuđman and his party came to power in early 90s that the date was changed. And the day of anti-fascist struggle, how it's called now, is still celebrated today on the 22nd of June, so the date of establishment of the Sisak partisan detachment. Colleague will speak about monuments, but I have a very short remark on it. So when it comes to monuments, immediately after the war, work was mainly done on commemorating fighters who fell in battle. Much less attention was paid to the suffering of civilians. Even the memorial in Jasenovac was built only in the 60s. Around some other places, activities started even later. So, for example, the memorial site on the place of Danica concentration camp in Koprivnica was opened only in 1981. The last 2 decades of socialist Yugoslavia were the time when monumental and artistically abstract, sometimes functional, monuments were erected all over the country. It was often about high-quality artistic creations by great artists, for example, Vojin Bakić. But this was already the time when party authorities had to seriously think about additional content of memorial complexes, for example, recreational or sports contents that were supposed to attract the visitors who were clearly losing interest in national liberation struggle. Last but not least, history teaching. Topics related to Second World War were included in the syllabi of schools in the area under the control of the partisans already during the war and entered all schools immediately after it. A significant intensification of teaching about national liberation struggle occurred from the end of 50s, when it was noticed that young generations who did not remember the war from their own experience were coming to schools. It was then when the expression that you can find in Snježana Koren's book appeared in one discussion. So in this, it was said that the memory of the war should be more vivid or more vigorous as time passes. So oppositely to the natural way how it can be. In history teaching, a large part of the 8th grade and primarily of primary school and 4th grade of secondary school was dedicated to teaching about the Second World War and national liberation struggle. The general history was presented quite briefly, but several times as much space was devoted to the war on the territory of Yugoslavia. And not only the merits of the Communist Party and Tito's genius was emphasized, but a narrative was created in which the struggle against the occupiers and the socialist revolution were equated. So literally the one title of lesson unit was Unity of National Liberation Struggle and the Socialist Revolution. So a Manichaetic black and white image was created, and participation in the participation of hundreds of thousands of people in partisan movement was equated with supporting the Communist Party in its vision of the transformation of society and politics. And to conclude, the main focus of the politics of history was on national liberation struggle during the time of socialist Yugoslavia, and this is clearly visible when we look at calendar of national holidays, streets names, history teaching, filmography, and so on. The merits of the Communist Party and in the fight against the occupiers and their helpers was supposed to give the party the right to lead the country after the war. It is precisely this legitimizing function of the history that I mentioned at the beginning. Thank you.
Magdalena, thank you.